People often ask, what are your inspirations? What are your favorite movies? What are your favorite books? Greetings and salutations, YouTube. I am the Nemean Beard. I am your host and your guide today. Today we're going to be talking about some of my favorite books that really influence the way I run Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop RPGs in general. But first, I'm going to take a drink of this coffee, and if you would like and mosey on over to the subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. This is Black Silk again. Still coffee, it's still okay. $6 for over a pound, that's a pretty good deal. I've definitely had better, and I've definitely had worse coffee. It has caffeine in it, so black bean juice good, right? When Gary Gygax published the Dungeon Master Guide, he made a list of authors and literary works which he stated these authors helped shape this game. While I'd read some of those works by the time I discovered D&D, that list opened my eyes to just how much fantasy literature was out there. And that original Appendix N doesn't even really scratch the surface. There was so much published in like the late 60s and the 70s and the early 80s. It's amazing, not to mention the rest of the amount of the other decades. Thus, the library became my new hangout. And so here are some of the books that influenced kind of the way I view fantasy and those that shaped my game. Now, this is not a top 10 fantasy book. You know, this isn't my top 10. These are just videos that I feel like really influenced the game of Dungeons and Dragons for me as a dungeon master. And this really has no particular order. The first one is Mythology by Edith Hamilton. It might actually have a subtitle to Mythology, Tales of Heroes and Gods or something like that. And this isn't a fiction, but it's a collection of Roman, Greek, and Norse myths. It kind of compares them in some spots. She arranges them into the myths of the gods and then the tales of the heroes. The biggest influence it had on my young mind, other than firing my imagination up, was that cultures could translate faiths and deities between them, sometimes having similar traditions and customs, yet in others they were completely opposite, right? I think this collection made me think of deities as both personalities and the embodiment of forces beyond our mortal kin. I remember a few years back in our first full-fledged 5e campaign, one of my players chose to play a warlock. Now his patron that chose him was this power known as Vahirudrith, the Star Unseen. I made that up. You know, a year and a half later, maybe not quite a year, later in game time after we'd been playing, this warlock, Simon Lake, finds out that his Patreon is none other than Kyrion, a big-time light deity in my world. That guy's got a whole continent named after him, and an empire that was founded in his name. The god was deposed somehow, and a usurper sits on his heavenly throne. But his worshippers were none the wiser. Now, he still has a small spark of divinity, and basically pressing warlocks into his service is about all that he can muster. Now, we've been playing in that same world. We're still playing in it 3 years later. And the PCs have never figured out who threw down the Lord of the Sun, Stars, and Candle. Up next, we have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I'm sure this makes a lot of people's lists. But when I think of the embodiment versus good and evil, I think this might be one of the best literary illustrations. I mean, it's pretty epic on its own, just the story, talking animals, ancient prophecies. I think this probably taught me about the law of betrayal, payment, and sacrifice, as well as the heavy redemption theme. It makes for some pretty amazing RP moments. Often I induce a decision or crisis where one PC might have to sacrifice their life or something dear to save another NPC or a kingdom. The Fionavar Tapestry by Guy Gavriel K. This might be one of the most underrated fantasy series of all time, in my humble opinion. I know some of his other works are extolled a lot. I really enjoyed The Lion of Al-Rassan. I know he did some work with the Tolkien estate, kind of finishing some things up and helping them, do some writer work for them to get stuff out after Tolkien had passed away. But it's a lovely blend of kind of Norse, Celtic, and the Arthurian mythos, and it introduces some cool concepts. Well, introduced them to me. I'm not sure that he came up with them, but it has like source magic, that a person is a wizard source. So in the book, for example, the main wizard, his source is this dwarf king named Matt Sorin, right? And so he kind of acts up as a well of magic. Now, again, that's not law. Don't take me that Kay introduced that. I don't know that. And another thing that Kay reinforces about his world is the localization of deities. That a god's or powerful spirit's power might wane the further they get from their domain. He's got like a god of the forest and the god of the sea, and the god of the forest is weak when he's away from his forest and near the sea. The best example I can think of in my own campaigns that I've used this is when a player bargained with a river god. This river god wanted to make a deal with the PC to chase off a nearby lake god. And that netted the character several boons, but it angered the lake god's brother, the god of the mountain, which made life really difficult for the PCs for a while. Up next, we have The Savage Sword of Conan. Now, I know it's not a novel, it's not a book, and I wouldn't actually come to read a Conan novel until I was in my 20s. In fact, I operated under the assumption that all there was the comic that Marvel Comics put out, Conan the Barbarian, and The Savage Sword of Conan. And then I realized there were these short stories that were published in like the pulp fiction magazines like Weird Tales. I love Howard's view of magic. As we've moved from 5th edition into sort of a D20 skill-based mod of 5th edition, I've tried to bring that feel, the idea that you might be more successful in a place of power with a magic ritual and a reagent, other than just using verbal material and some somatic components all the time. I like that idea of stronghold magic and ley lines and places of power, and the fact that magic is strange and not a lot of people have access to it. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This was one of the books I had to read in middle school, except I was kind of excited about this one. This too is on most people's list, I suspect. I can't tell you how many things I've taken from this work over the years. Wandering wizards, magic rings, dragons taking kingdoms from dwarves, talking wolves, wargs, if you will, deep-dwelling madmen. And that's not all. It might be easier to think of the things I haven't borrowed from this book. It was a huge influence on me, mostly because I read it actually before I started to play D&D. And I think this was probably one of the stories that kind of first introduced an unlikely hero to me in Bilbo Baggins. My next book is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. I know this isn't a fantasy book, strictly speaking, at least not in terms of D&D fantasy, but there was something kind of romantic about this dark tale of a mysterious entity that heads a nightmarish carnival that sucks the life out of a town. I'm old-fashioned that way. I can't tell you how many times I've used Mr. Dark either. Someone who should be an ally, but feels all wrong, then is revealed to be a villain, but then not just a villain, so much more. The Tempter archetype portrayed by the illustrated man I found most useful. But there was a quote that shaped my view of those people of shadow that don't quite fit into the natural world. Plus, creepy carnivals are always a nice touch. The quote is this: For some, autumn comes early, stays late through life. For these beings, fall is the ever normal season, the only weather. There be no choice beyond. Where do they come from? The dust. Where do they go? The grave. Does blood stir in their veins? No, the night wind. What ticks in their head? The worm. What speaks from their mouth? The toad. What sees from their eyes? The snake. What hears from their ear? The abyss between the stars. They sift the human storm for souls, eat flesh of reason, fill tombs with sinners. They frenzy forth. In gusts they beetle scurry, creep, thread, filter, motion, make all moons sullen and surely cloud all clear run waters. The spider web hears them, trembles, breaks. Such are the autumn people. Beware of them. That line sold me on that book. Whenever I'm devising a creepy character or a character that's kind of outside the bounds that flits on the supernatural, I think of the people of autumn. The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Again, this is another book that's probably on a lot of people's top X books. And there's a lot to be said about this novel. But I think the Lancelot in this book is second to none. My view of a broken romantic hero, fully noble yet full of failing and fully admitting his faults, stems deeply from this Lancelot. The Count of Monte Cristo. Now, this was another school forced read, but one that taught me a lot about politics and revenge. This book is a classic in the conventional term for a lot of reasons, but I think what gets me the most, even more than the intrigue and the extreme pettiness of powerful men and not getting what they want and what they'll do to take the revenge on people that seem happy, is the latter plan that Edmund uses. That serves to me as a great blueprint or template for creating revenge plots within the game. You start small, you go here, you take away resources, you go around the character, you don't just go right at them. And I really enjoyed that. And I've tried to incorporate that and allow avenues for that, even though my players don't always take that route. I'm always aware that that should be an option. We're getting close to the end here, folks. The Witch Hunter series by C.L. Werner. Now, this is another highly underrated gem in the realm of fantasy. Now, this is from Warhammer, the Warhammer line. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is one of my favorite systems, mostly second edition. The Empire in the old world has a really unique voice in fantasy tabletop RPGs. And when I learned that they destroyed it, basically because, in my opinion, it was because they wanted to put all their money into 40K, which was probably where they were making money. So when I heard that they destroyed it for a business reason, I understood, but at the same time, I really hated that. The Gortek and Felix books were really good, or I liked them anyway. And this book here, these books, the Witch Hunter trilogy, they were amazing. I think it was the perfect novel to represent the old world away from the battlefield. A strange and a dark place, lots of isolation. And I think what these books communicate to me is that even the world can be its own type of monster. For Old Night has many teeth and many tricks, and we must remain vigilant if we are to survive until the morning. The Dragonlance Chronicles. I could hardly hope to ever run a campaign that's half as epic as this trilogy. This, to me, is the consummate blueprint for a campaign, start to finish. The world's deep, but able to be communicated fairly easily. The narrative draws in the cast without feeling too railroady, yet it still gives them freedom to explore, and, you know, it involves plenty of backstory. I've taken several things from the Chronicles over the years, but I think the best lesson from this series as a DM for me is learning to start from the end. The epic moments at the conclusion of this series, of each individual book, really, I think that's what we DMs live for. I mean, going into a dark temple outside of time, maybe, with a player that's attempting to both help his party and replace the god of darkness, an epic war on dragon back wielding mythical lances, a battle atop a high cleric's tower against dragons where you're, yeah, it's just, and you got to use this orb that you didn't think was anything. We want our players to be challenged through combat, through moral challenges, against their own assumptions of truth, against spiritual affirmations, that ends in this apex of action where all the magic items, the NPC favors, and skills they learn can come into play. Now, the conclusion of this trilogy, the original trilogy, may be a bit out of the DM's reach, but maybe not impossible. I still hope to be able to have a campaign where the party is split and separated, but still be able to work towards a common goal. That's just a dream of mine. Maybe I'll get to do it, maybe I won't. Well, thank you guys for sticking around. I hope this video, if nothing else, encouraged you to read some of these books. Like I said, this is no definitive top 10, just books that inform my way of thinking towards running D&D and tabletop RPGs. So let me know what your favorite books are. I love to read, though now I mostly consume books via Audible. Stay safe out there. Strange days we're living in. But until we meet again, game well.